I arrived in South Africa at the very young age of 19 in 1950. I didn't expect anything. I didn't really know very much about the society and the country, except that it was a hot place and there were lions running around somewhere. However, what shocked me and surprised me was the invisible war that existed in South Africa between two major societies. This barrier was extreme. There was no social contact, there was no political contact, and there was no cultural contact between the two societies. Shortly after the war in Berlin, I was about 15 years old, 1945-46. Through the family there was a professional photographer who gave me lessons and taught me. And when Berlin, the blockade came to Berlin, I managed to get to Hamburg and I got a position as a trainee. So when I, 2 years later in 1950, emigrated to South Africa, I saw myself as hopefully becoming a professional photographer. And most of the years I worked in South Africa, I really worked as a freelance. I came across drum in 1951, mid-1951. I think that drum had an effect, a positive effect on the black world by giving them a voice, somewhere where they could talk to each other. And I think that was its greatest success. Drum also, of course, spoke to the world. The starting of the whole township music was it must have already started in the late 40s or mid-40s already. Youngsters came to Johannesburg, they tried to make the penny a living, and they bought or got themselves what you call the penny whistle. And they formed a little group and they got somebody with an old guitar, and they were all over Johannesburg making music, which made Johannesburg very lively and very exciting at the time. And many of those who started this way became eventually the saxophonists and the trombonists and so on, and the famous musician in South Africa. What I did find is this, and especially in the early 50s, this tremendous dynamic spirit for life, a tremendous amount of enthusiasm and humor. I believe it related to the hope and the knowledge that apartheid would not last. Unfortunately, it did still last another 40 years. However, people looked to America, they emulated the jazz that came from America and called it township jazz. What was rather depressing or sad for many of the South African black musicians that they were not allowed to play in a mixed audience and quite often not to white audience. I found that jazz, especially jazz, was a form of defiance against the laws and the restrictions. The arts were a way of overcoming the hardships, and it was a way of looking towards and hoping towards a future, and it was a way to survive. And I think that Dolly Rateba, a famous South African blues singer, actually once said this, that music kept me alive. I began to find the white society terribly boring. On the one hand, you had the British colonials who were still living in an old England. They might have left England many years ago, and they still thought and they were not anymore. They had lost the modern English touch that existed then at the time. The Afrikaners were the Boers, the apartheid government. They were very much hateful always towards the British as well because of the Boer War. So there was a lot of conflict between the two groups. When they met me, or when I met them as a young German, their first reaction was, there's another one of us, another racist come Nazi, and they were quite horrified when I objected strongly about them identifying me with racism. It seemed, strangely enough, I seemed to be more accepted in the black society than in the white, simply because if I went to a political or social or cultural event and photographed it, most of the time I was maybe the only photographer there. And people were terribly pleased that someone took an interest in their affairs, in their issues. Well, one of the most vicious laws in South Africa was the pass law, where every black male in the beginning, and then also black women as well, had to carry a pass book. It wasn't just an ID card, it was a book. And in this book they had to identify and give their employer, had to sign every month that they were being employed and that they were working, and where they were living, and their restrictions. They were not allowed, for example, to move from one area to another. In other words, if you lived in a township or in a suburb in Johannesburg, you couldn't go to and just live or visit another suburb in another town nearby. You had to get a permit to move. Often they got, for not having a pass or their pass not being updated, they were put into prison for a couple of weeks. And if by then they didn't have a family member or somebody helping to sort out these issues, they were either rearrested or they had to sign up to work on a farm on a 9 months contract, or work on the roads on a 9 months or a year contract. So that was a sort of very cunning form of slave labor. There was these two people, and I photographed them, and suddenly these two policemen came down the road, and so they were immediately frightened because they felt that their passes weren't up to date, and they hid behind the wall. And I then took some pictures of the policemen, and I attracted them to a degree that they didn't look left or right. Drum, at one point, this was somewhere in March 1952, decided to do a feature about Dolly Ratable, a film star, a blues singer really, and she had been in a film, and she was maybe the first South African black film star. We decided, or the editor decided, that we need to have a picture for the cover in her in a bathing costume. It was always the sort of thing people wanted. But Johannesburg is something like 500 or what kilometers away from the nearest beach. However, around Johannesburg you have these large mine dumps. So Dolly and myself decided to go on a mine dump and take a picture of her on top of the mine dump, and then it would look as if she's on the beach, you see. But in the meantime, somebody who must have been watering his garden or so must have phoned the police. And the next thing is we had the flying squad charging us on top of the mine dump and pushing us around and accusing us of having committed the Immorality Act. In South Africa at that time you had a law that sex across the colour bars was against the law, and you would be sent to prison without the option of the fine for at least 9 months. Eventually we were taken to the police station, and the editor of the paper came over and helped to release us. So it wasn't only against the law that you weren't allowed to for instance, drink alcohol together, or for black people to drink alcohol or come to your home. But it was not just a law, but it was a social taboo to actually mix or have black friends, or black people mixing with whites and so on. But I think that today South Africa is, for me, it's a free country. It is a democracy. It has terrible problems. It has problems of unemployment, it has problems of AIDS, problem of TB, for example. One of the major problems is the lack of education and lack of teachers. Maybe it isn't a rainbow nation yet, but it's going that way, I'm pretty sure. But it still will have a lot of hiccups.